I recall the correspondence as if it were yesterday. It arrived, precisely folded, within my postal receptacle, concealed within a glossy Homeowners Association folder that exuded an aura of authority and disdain. The typeface was rigid, the wording passive-aggressive, and the intent unmistakable. You are in contravention of Covenant Regulations 14.2 pertaining to visible auxiliary structures. Non-compliance may incur daily penalties and formal enforcement proceedings. Initially, I found it amusing. Truly, I erupted in laughter. For the preceding 8 months, I had been engaged in the refurbishment of the detached auxiliary building situated on the periphery of my land. This was no dilapidated eyesore, no collection of corroded refuse, but rather a well-ordered, functional edifice adorned with contemporary cladding, matching roofing materials, and integrated illumination. It was discreetly positioned behind a privacy barrier, largely ensconced in the shade of mature cottonwood trees. Yet, evidently, a member of the HOA board had deemed it a visual disturbance. That particular individual, as I would subsequently discover, was a woman named Claire, though her true appellation was invariably uttered by her neighbors with a disparaging undertone. Ah, Karen. That evening I stood on my rear patio, cradling a mug of coffee, observing the descent of the sun beyond the rolling landscape of our enclave. It was an idyllic scene. The cicadas had commenced their evening chorus. I could discern the gentle illumination of patio lanterns appearing along the thoroughfare. Power conduits emitted a soft hum overhead. These very conduits originated from the electrical substation situated just beyond the western incline. The same substation I had discreetly acquired 3 years prior through a government surplus auction, and which I meticulously maintained on a quarterly basis with my own hands. That night, I perused the violation notice once more under the radiant glow emanating from my workshop's overhead fixture. It enumerated several infractions beyond the mere presence of the workshop. My recreational vehicle parked adjacent to the garage, a composting receptacle concealed behind the fence, and an unapproved hue on the rear service door of the shed. Each point was patently preposterous, petty, and ambiguous. Nevertheless, I comprehended their underlying objective. They intended to subjugate me, mirroring their actions against the couple across the way who were compelled to excavate their indigenous flora and install HOA-sanctioned sod, or the single mother on Juniper Lane whose portable basketball apparatus was dismantled during her absence at work. However, I was not like them. I detached the missive and affixed it to the interior surface of the shed door. Subsequently, I retrieved the original property documentation provided to me at the time of purchase. No mention of Rule 14.2 was present. In fact, there were several discrepancies between that initial charter and the revised directives referenced in the HOA's warning. Consequently, the subsequent day, I proceeded to the HOA office, a modest stucco structure adorned with 2 banners at its facade and an overwatered fuchsia bush near the entrance. The receptionist, a woman whose countenance suggested a lifelong frown, barely deigned to look up as I requested a copy of the operative covenants, conditions, and restrictions. "You will need to submit a formal request," she stated flatly. "I am a homeowner," I countered. "This situation directly impacts me. I am not inquiring about classified intelligence. I am requesting a document that you profess to enforce." She presented me with a form, which I completed in silence. As I returned it, I perceived a reflection in the corner glass partition. Claire. She was positioned behind the partially ajar conference room door, observing me with that characteristic Karen expression, lips pursed, arms crossed, her visage conveying an unspoken, "How dare you not acquiesce quietly?" I offered a subtle nod. She did not reciprocate. 3 days later, another correspondence materialized, this time hand-delivered. A second violation notification, now accompanied by appended penalties, amounting to $75 per diem retroactively. The correspondence cited my lack of responsiveness and unwillingness to engage in HOA-sanctioned conflict resolution protocols. They were intensifying their efforts. I recognized the indicators. In my 30 years managing municipal infrastructure projects, I had frequently witnessed bureaucracies employing intimidation tactics to secure compliance, typically targeting small contractors or ill-informed property owners. And the most detrimental action one can take when confronted with such a display of power is to succumb to panic. Therefore, I did not. Instead, I composed a response, clear and legally sound. I petitioned for a hearing before the Architectural Review Committee, referencing both the outdated documentation and the evident procedural inconsistencies. I appended photographic evidence of my property, copies of dated permits, and invoices from a licensed contractor. I personally delivered it to the HOA office and requested a time-stamped receipt. The receptionist evinced exasperation, but duly stamped it. I departed from the premises with a sense of composure and focus. However, that serenity was short-lived, for less than 48 hours later, on a blustery Thursday afternoon, I returned home to find my residence entirely devoid of illumination. The porch light was defunct. The garage door opener failed to respond from within. Every electrical appliance was deactivated. No refrigeration, no ceiling fan, not even the subtle hum of standby circuits. The power was extinguished. Initially, I surmised a grid malfunction, but a survey of the adjacent properties revealed a contrary scenario. Every other domicile was brightly illuminated, as usual. Patio lights aglow, climate control systems functioning, children's bedroom windows flickering with animated programs. Only my dwelling was plunged into darkness. A knot formed in my stomach. I proceeded to the side panel, where the primary electrical connection was located. It was then that I observed it. A crude tag affixed to the enclosure, bearing the HOA insignia emblazoned across a sticker that proclaimed Disconnected Enforcement Action Rule 14.2. They had actually done it. They had severed my power. And in that precise moment, something within me underwent a transformation. Not anger, not indignation, but an undeniable clarity. If they desired a demonstration of their authority, so be it. They had, however, chosen to confront the wrong individual. I did not immediately contact the power utility. I remained stationary for a considerable duration, fixated on the severed tag, attempting to process the gravity of the situation. I was not bewildered. No, I was absorbing the implications. There is a distinction. Bewilderment befalls those who cannot comprehend what lies ahead. I understood all too well. This was not merely an act of reprisal. It was a deliberate message. The HOA had unilaterally enacted measures to terminate essential services to my residents. No hearing, no notification from the utility provider, merely a brazen maneuver by a board that presumed dominion over all, shielded by bylaws and superficial congeniality. And the most egregious aspect, they lacked even the requisite legal standing. I returned inside, activating switches out of ingrained habit, despite knowing their futility. The air within the house was already beginning to feel stagnant. My refrigerator emitted a silent hum. I opened it nonetheless. Room temperature. Dozens of dollars worth of fresh provisions, now wilting and softening. I closed the door. My chest felt constricted, but I harbored no fear. I was strategizing. They presumed I was akin to the other residents in this neighborhood, quiescent retirees, young families, individuals either too courteous or too preoccupied to engage in conflict. They were unaware that I had dedicated years to public utility oversight, formulating the very regulations that stipulated the operational parameters of electrical grids. I had testified before state committees. I had reviewed agreements between municipalities and energy providers. I had drafted clauses that, to this day, appear verbatim in the fine print of their local grid management protocols. More significantly, however, I possessed knowledge that eluded them, the precise origin of their power supply. Literally, I had acquired the substation 3 years prior in what the county perceived as an obsolete infrastructure divestiture. They assumed it was a defunct transmission relay, destined for salvage or demolition, but I knew it remained active, still connected. It had been functioning under a legacy agreement with a third-party private grid provider, discreetly supplying electricity to 2 adjacent communities, including my own. I maintained ownership through an LLC, attended to its upkeep, and remitted the nominal property taxes without raising suspicion. The reason? I harbored a profound distrust in delegating the maintenance of system integrity to others, having witnessed pervasive corruption during my final years on the job. And now, the HOA had irrevocably crossed a boundary. I did not contact the power company that night. I did not alert the authorities. No, I allowed them to savor their illusory sense of control for a brief period longer. I proceeded to the generator housed in the detached workshop, but upon opening the side panel, I was arrested in my tracks. It was gone. The bolt securing it to the platform had been forcefully sheared off. The cables had been severed with cutting implements and discarded in a nearby pile. The concrete slab still bore the telltale oil stain where it had once rested. My backup power source had vanished. It was then that I understood this was not an issue of aesthetics. It was a calculated act of sabotage. I reviewed my surveillance footage. 3 of the external cameras were incapacitated, but one, mounted high on the rear awning, provided a partial view. I meticulously scrolled through the recordings until I located it. Shortly after midnight the preceding evening, 2 individuals, identifiable by their HOA vests. One was wielding bolt cutters. The other carried what appeared to be a clipboard. They moved with an air of confidence, not stealth. They had absconded with the generator. They had severed my electrical lines, and they exhibited no concern about being observed. The subsequent morning, I drove to the city's Public Utility Administrative Center. Not the public-facing facility, but the engineering annex in the rear, which remains largely unseen by the general populace. I still maintained contacts there. One of them, Dennis, was now a senior technician, but I recalled him as the intern who fetched us coffee during rate negotiation assemblies. He greeted me with a smile. "Retirement treating you poorly?" he quipped. I returned his smile. "Let's just say I'm dealing with novices." Dennis raised an eyebrow and gestured me into his office. I recounted the entire sequence of events, discreetly and meticulously. I presented him with the photographic stills from the surveillance footage, the violation notice, and the HOA tag affixed to my electrical panel. I observed his smile gradually dissipate. "They severed your residential feed?" he inquired. I nodded. "Without utility intervention, no public safety notification, no permit, nothing. They simply entered your property and disconnected the power." Dennis regarded me as if I had just declared the earth had ceased its rotation. "That's criminal tampering. They aren't even a licensed service provider." "Precisely," I affirmed. "That's why I'm here. I require a formal inspection of the grid relay servicing our block, and I want it officially documented." Dennis did not hesitate. He retrieved a form, signed it himself, and provided me with the inspection date, 5 days hence. Subsequently, I made another stop, the clerk's office at City Hall. I requested a copy of the original infrastructure agreement pertaining to our HOA district and the property ownership history of the parcel on which the substation is situated. As the clerk printed the documents, she appeared perplexed. "This cannot be correct. It states here that the substation is privately owned, not by the city." "It is accurate," I replied. She examined the document more closely. "Owned by Willow Creek Systems, LLC. "That's me." She blinked. I smiled. By the time I returned home, the sun was already low in the sky. My house remained in a state of silent darkness. I lit a few candles, opened the windows, and settled on the front porch, sipping chilled coffee. The remainder of the neighborhood was abuzz with activity, sprinklers operating, television screens glowing behind drawn curtains, lawn illumination emitting a soft radiance, the facade of communal civility fully operational. I observed Claire, the HOA matriarch, pull into her driveway directly across the street. She paused, cast a glance at my darkened residence, and offered a smirk. She believed they had prevailed, but my phase of defensive maneuvers was concluded. The following day, I drafted a formal and precise letter. It served to inform the HOA that their unauthorized disconnection of my property had been duly reported to both the local utility commission and the State Energy Oversight Board. I appended time-stamped photographic evidence and a copy of the inspection order. I even included a courtesy copy to a legal counsel with whom I had previously collaborated at the state capitol. not out of immediate necessity for representation, but to ensure they recognized the name. And then I waited. Because when one possesses control over the current, it is merely a matter of time before everyone else realizes the illumination can be extinguished. It was sometime around 2 in the morning when the full implication of their actions truly registered. The house was still and frigid, far too quiet for an individual accustomed to the perpetual hum of servers and substations. I sat in my kitchen, enveloped in an aged flannel blanket, sipping lukewarm tea I had prepared on a camping stove I had not utilized in years. The LED lantern cast elongated shadows across the ceiling, flickering faintly as I adjusted its position. Scout, my venerable shepherd, Mix, lay at my feet. Even he appeared restless, his ears twitching at every subtle sound, his tail thudding against the hardwood floor whenever a vehicle passed outside. He possessed an innate ability to discern when something was amiss. He always did. The refrigerator stood as a silent monolith against the wall, lifeless within. The once reliable drone of electricity that permeated my home had been supplanted by a profound stillness. No furnace, no freezer, no reassuring whir of security cameras repositioning on their mounts. Merely the chill of the early spring night air seeping through the slightly ajar window above the sink. And somewhere across the street, I envisioned Claire sleeping soundly in her excessively insulated 2-story dwelling, cooled by the air conditioning unit I had assisted in installing during my tenure with the city. Irony, a truly harsh mistress. I ought to have been irate, even furious. Yet, anger was not the predominant emotion. What I experienced most acutely was disappointment. Not directed at them, nor even at the system itself. I was disappointed in myself for underestimating the extent to which petty tyrants become emboldened when granted a clipboard and a set of arbitrary regulations. That night, I revisited my documentation. I retrieved every violation notice I had received since relocating here. All 3 of them, each escalating in tone, in threat, in sheer absurdity. The initial notice pertained to my recreational vehicle. The second concerned the shed. The third, which accompanied the power disconnection, cited a non-compliance with emergency safety standards. That particular notice was so vaguely phrased, it held little substantive meaning. They were probing, searching for any pretext they could leverage to justify their actions. However, I had perused sufficient municipal code throughout my career to recognize that enforcement lacking legal authority is merely harassment cloaked in bureaucratic paperwork. My printer, predictably, was inoperative, but I had no need for printed materials. My objective was recollection. I unearthed my old journal. I had not penned entries in it for years, not since Martha's passing, but something about the profound quiet of that night, the unnerving darkness, the flickering candle beside me, it compelled me to reach for that time-worn leather cover. I opened it to a blank page and inscribed, "Mom," as they cut my power, not merely the current, but the current of trust that binds communities together. I gazed at the sentence for a prolonged interval, then added, "Oh, they are unaware of it yet, but tomorrow they shall discover that the power they covet originates from me." It felt rather dramatic at the time, yet possessed a peculiar truth. Around 3:15 in the morning, the temperature had dropped sufficiently for my breath to become visible. I retrieved the camping blankets and layered them upon the bed. Scout ascended beside me, an indulgence I typically refrained from, but tonight was no ordinary night. I lay there, unable to find sleep. Images cascaded through my mind, not solely the generator being wrenched from its foundation, but recollections of other homeowners I had witnessed being steamrolled by overzealous boards, the elderly gentleman in Pine County subjected to daily fines for planting daisies in a non-approved hue, or the young veteran in Cypress Hills who had a therapy shed for his PTSD but was compelled to dismantle it due to non-conformity. Those cases haunted me, not merely due to the injustice, but because I had, at one time, been complicit within the very apparatus that overlooked such indignities. Now I was the target, and I would not be disregarded. At some point, I succumbed to slumber. I retain no memory of falling asleep, only the chill of the sheets and the steady rhythm of Scout's breathing pressed against my side. By morning, the sun pierced through the eastern blinds like a silent indictment. I arose stiffly, my joints aching, my body sore from the arduous night. I boiled water once more, prepared instant oatmeal, and fed Scout. Then I opened the windows and stood in the profound silence of my powerless abode. And it was then that I heard it. Across the street, Claire was vociferating into her phone, her voice sharp and unmistakable. "I don't care if it's maintenance. Why was no one informed that my entire wine refrigerator is non-operational, the security gate refuses to open, and the pool lights are defunct? Rectify this immediately." I smiled, precisely as anticipated. You see, I had submitted a preemptive maintenance notification for the substation on the very same day I visited Dennis. And given that I legally retained ownership and, crucially, possessed a certified license to oversee private grid infrastructure under my LLC, I was authorized to temporarily suspend the system for inspection and minor repairs, provided appropriate notice was furnished to the city clerk's office and the local utility provider, which I had diligently provided. The shutdown commenced precisely at 6 o'clock in the morning. A deliberate delay was implemented to ensure the majority of homeowners were aware of their situation when their power was interrupted. This action impacted 3 designated zones labeled A through C. Claire resided in Zone B. I then discerned another voice, deeper and more agitated. Claire's husband, Martin, the HOA treasurer. He strode across their front lawn, phone in hand, heading directly toward my residence. I met him at the edge of my porch. "What in the devil is going on?" he demanded. "Is this your doing?" I nodded slowly. "Maintenance was scheduled and it was legal. You cannot simply cut power to the entire subdivision." I tilted my head. "Interesting. That is precisely what you did to me." His face flushed crimson. "You're playing games. This is retaliation." "No, Martin," I corrected calmly. "Retaliation would involve filing a lawsuit. This is Regulation Code 47.13. I suggest you consult it." He opened his mouth to retort, but then faltered. I observed a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even apprehension, cross his features. He turned and retreated toward his driveway. I did not pursue him. Instead, I returned to my house, still without power, yet feeling more in command than I ever had. I poured myself another cup of lukewarm tea and sat at the kitchen table in silence. It was a silence I could readily endure, because now it was not merely my house residing in darkness. The true advantage of being underestimated lies in the profound resonance of silence when individuals finally grasp the magnitude of their miscalculation. That was the resonance I was now perceiving, less in terms of decibels and more in the pregnant pause between accusations. A subtle shift in tone, a dawning suspicion in Claire's gaze, and Martin's posture, an unspoken refrain echoing, "Precisely, who is this man?" They never bothered to inquire when I initially moved in. Merely another older gentleman with a pickup truck, a workshop, and a canine companion. Pleasant enough but not overly gregarious, I maintained my solitude, remitted dues punctually, diligently mowed the lawn, and eschewed festive seasonal decorations. Individuals like Claire tend to overlook men such as myself. I had retired 6 years prior from a position that most individuals would find incomprehensible if I were to attempt an explanation. Technically, I held the title of senior engineer on the State Energy Infrastructure Committee, but in practical terms, it meant I had dedicated decades to the design and auditing of electrical grid frameworks, substation redundancy strategies, and disaster contingency plans for major municipal entities. I possessed an intrinsic understanding not only of how power functioned, but also of precisely who held dominion over it, under which statutes, and how frequently HOAs overstepped their designated boundaries. They were never intended to function as governmental bodies. However, in the interstitial spaces of genuine municipal oversight, particularly within privatized developments, they began to proliferate. Miniature principalities, petty dictatorships, and at times they fostered a belief in their own invincibility, yet no one remains invulnerable when their existence is predicated upon power. And you, sir, possessed the switch. The morning following the power disconnection, I stood at the perimeter gate of the substation. My substation, adorned in a high-visibility vest and a name badge affixed to my collar, proudly bearing the inscription, Willow Creek Systems, LLC, Authorized Access. It was still early. Most residents were just commencing to discover their lack of illumination. Some attributed it to a general grid issue. Others attempted to reset their circuit breakers. Claire, however, had already inundated the neighborhood Facebook group with outlandish accusations. Someone has sabotaged the grid. We are being targeted. This is a flagrant violation of our civil rights. It is amusing how swiftly she assumed the mantle of victimhood. I paid it all no mind. I was far too engrossed in inspecting line loads, manually engaging breakers, and meticulously documenting worn components. Genuine maintenance work that was critically necessary because I was not engaging in a charade. This was not merely an act of vengeance. It presented an opportune moment. I had Dennis on speakerphone as I worked. He guided me through the updated inspection protocols, instructed me to photograph the grounding relays and breaker sequencing, and reminded me that the city's energy auditor would be arriving within 48 hours. "You're conducting this entirely by the book, correct?" Dennis inquired. "Every page," I affirmed. He paused. "Good, because they're already calling down here, screaming about lawsuits." A smirk played on my lips. Let them. The truth was, no legal counsel in this entire county could contest the rights of a legitimate infrastructure owner undertaking scheduled upkeep on their private domain, particularly when every action was meticulously documented and officially reported to the relevant municipal bodies. What they failed to grasp, and what I now made no attempt to conceal, was my actual role. I was the power company. In essence, the substation had been overlooked by the primary utility provider when a new power line was established in the adjacent district. However, the planned transition never occurred. The old line still supplied electricity to several hundred residences, and I had legally acquired it for a sum considerably less than the cost of a pre-owned pickup truck. The Homeowners Association remained oblivious because they had never bothered to scrutinize the energy service agreement appended to the neighborhood's foundational documents. They operated under the assumption that their dues covered standard public utility access. In reality, they were dependent on a modest, long-standing power grid managed by a discrete limited liability company. Mine. Back at my residence, I retrieved the mail. Another correspondence from the HOA. This one lacked its usual assertive tone. It was a formal request for mediation. They proposed a meeting to explore mutually agreeable solutions and resolve recent misunderstandings. I chuckled. It's astonishing what people are willing to discuss once their internet access is terminated. The meeting was slated for that Friday at the HOA's offices. I arrived 5 minutes early, anticipating the satisfaction of observing their unease. Claire Martin, along with 2 other board members, were seated at the gleaming oval table, paper cups of coffee before them, their printed agendas open but unread. They appeared weary and disheveled. I entered wearing the identical high-visibility vest and identification badge from the substation. I remained silent as I took my seat, simply crossing my arms and awaiting their lead. Claire cleared her throat. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, "we wanted to thank you for coming." I offered a single nod. She shifted uncomfortably. "We acknowledge there have been miscommunications. The power interruption, for instance, has caused significant disruption." I maintained a neutral expression. Martin interjected, "We were unaware of the ownership status of the substation. Had you known," I inquired, "you would have acted differently?" He blinked. "Well, yes." I leaned forward. "So, you admit you acted under the presumption that you held authority over something you did not, and that presumption led you to trespass on my property, damage my generator, and sever my electrical connection, all without any legal authorization?" Claire's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "I possess comprehensive documentation," I continued. "Security footage, inspection records, and a complete report scheduled for submission to the city's Utility Oversight Board by the end of next week." "Mr. Reynolds," Claire said, her voice suddenly softer, We understand this has become complicated. Perhaps we can agree on a resolution." "Your actions endangered me," I interrupted. "You left an occupied dwelling without power, removed critical equipment, and did so without any justification or prior notification. That is more than complicated, Miss Holbrook. That constitutes criminal exposure." Her eyes flashed slightly at the mention of her surname. "I have no desire to initiate legal proceedings against you," I added, "though I would prevail. I do not wish to involve the media, despite their existing interest. My objective is straightforward." All leaned forward expectantly. "I require a public acknowledgement of your overreach. I expect the HOA to retract all violations, cease any enforcement actions against my property, and issue a formal apology to every homeowner impacted by the blackout." Martin raised a hand. "That is—" I stood. "You can prepare for the next scheduled maintenance, which, I should note, is due again in 12 days. I departed before they could respond. By the time I reached home, I had 3 missed calls and 1 voicemail from the HOA office. Claire's voice was weary, barely a whisper. "We accept your terms." I deleted it. They still were not privy to all my actions. For instance, the press hadn't merely learned of the blackout, they had been invited. I had dispatched a polite professional notice to them the previous day regarding a neighborhood grid shutdown linked to questionable HOA conduct, and they were en route, as this was no longer solely about me. It was about power, who wielded it, who abused it, and who was finally prepared to initiate change. The morning after the HOA's feeble attempt at diplomacy, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a mug of black coffee that had grown cold twice already. Scout lay snoring near the back door, blissfully unaware that his human was preparing for an escalation. I had no need to involve the city further, neither legally nor procedurally. However, I desired a documented record, one that could not be obscured by HOA apologies or informal settlements. Claire and Martin might have conceded to my terms, but I understood how these situations typically unfolded. They would bide their time, await the public's waning attention, and then retaliate with greater cunning, caution, and manipulation. Thus, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't contacted in years. "Office of Public Records. This is Joanne." I smiled. The same voice, the same no-nonsense tone. "Joanne, it's Tom Reynolds, formerly of State Energy Infrastructure." A pause followed by a delighted chuckle. "Well, I'll be. I thought you'd vanished to a cabin somewhere." "Close enough," I replied. "I've encountered a minor HOA predicament." Another pause. "Oof, say no more." Joanne had been the city clerk for over a decade, and prior to that, she had worked in public utilities alongside me. She was sharp, meticulous, and maintained an exhaustive mental archive of every bureaucratic misstep in the county. "I need to retrieve some archival files," I stated. "Specifically, the original utility infrastructure contracts for the Creekwood Estates development dating back to approximately 1997. Also, the maintenance addendum from 2004. She didn't inquire about the reason, simply asking, "Do you want it emailed or printed?" "Printed. Certified if possible. I'll be by in an hour." As I hung up, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in weeks, a tranquil sense of purpose. I was no longer merely defending myself. I was constructing a digital safeguard. At City Hall, Joanne greeted me at the side entrance, presenting a file folder with a raised eyebrow. "You weren't exaggerating," she commented. "This development is quite the convoluted situation." I accepted the folder and opened it while seated on a bench outside. The original 1997 document corroborated my suspicions. The neighborhood had been established under a limited utility transition clause, implying a temporary connection to an existing power grid via the Willow Ridge substation, the very one I now possessed. The 2004 addendum proved even more illuminating. It indicated that the city had intended to transfer the neighborhood to the new municipal grid, but failed to complete the process due to a reallocation of budgetary resources. In simpler terms, they had forgotten. Legally, this meant the HOA's jurisdiction terminated at the electricity meter. Everything beyond that point, the wiring, the power feed, the transformer, the substation, remained part of a private infrastructure network, mine. And the most significant aspect was that the HOA had been issuing enforcement notices citing municipal compliance violations that were inapplicable to private power systems. I turned to the final page and smiled. A stamp confirmed its filing and recording, County Infrastructure Archive, precisely what I required. That afternoon, I converted the documents into a PDF and attached them to an email directed to the local utility commissioner, the HOA's legal counsel, the investigative columnist for the local newspaper, and for thoroughness, Claire Holbrook. The subject line read, "Clarification regarding utility ownership and oversight in Creekwood Estates." The body of the email was concise, courteous, and professional. I wrote, "Dear all, please find attached certified documentation confirming ownership and jurisdictional oversight of the Willow Ridge substation, including current feed responsibilities to Creekwood Estates. Given recent HOA enforcement actions taken without legal authority over private infrastructure, I feel compelled to ensure all parties are aligned on the facts. I remain open to a cooperative resolution, but I also believe transparency serves the best interests of our community. Respectfully, Tom Reynolds, Willow Creek Systems, LLC." I clicked send and leaned back in my chair. Within 30 minutes, I had received red receipts from every recipient except Claire. Hers bounced back with an automated reply, "Out of office for HOA strategic planning retreat." I laughed so heartily that Scout jumped. That evening, the local paper contacted me through a junior reporter named Mallory, young, eager, and clearly still developing her journalistic skills. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, "we received your email. Would you object if we published a brief article in tomorrow's edition?" "Proceed," I responded. "But if you are astute, come tomorrow morning and bring a photographer. I will be at the substation." "Why?" she inquired. "Because I am installing a new sign." She was silent for a moment. "What kind of sign?" "You will see." The following morning, I stood at the entrance to the substation, fully equipped in safety gear, and bolted a new placard onto the fence. It read, "Private utility property, maintenance scheduled, trespassing, subject to prosecution." Below that, in smaller lettering, "Inquiries, Willow Creek Systems, LLC, owner and operators." Mallory arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by a cameraman and a notebook. She captured photographs of me installing the sign, of the substation panels, and then we sat on the tailgate of my truck. She posed questions, insightful ones, not only about the power outage but also about my reasons for purchasing the substation, its implications for the neighborhood, and the message I intended to convey. I looked her directly in the eye and stated, "Power is not derived from titles or boisterous meetings. It stems from understanding how systems function and from the willingness to stand as a barrier between abuse and the operational switch." The article appeared the next day under the headline, "Retired Engineer Leverages Legal Authority to Neutralize HOA." The story gained rapid traction, was picked up by 2 neighboring counties, reposted on local forums, and even referenced on a morning radio show. Suddenly, individuals across town were discussing the man who owned the substation. Some lauded me as a hero, while others considered me irrational. However, what truly mattered was the shift in the prevailing narrative. Claire could not suppress this information, nor could Martin distort it. The truth was disseminated in print, posted publicly, and broadcast widely. And for the first time, the community was attentive. By Friday, I had received over 24 emails from neighbors expressing their gratitude, inquiring about ways to resist other enforcement threats, and some even apologizing for their delayed intervention. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Eileen residing on Sycamore Drive. She wrote, "We have lived here for 11 years. They cited us twice for wind chimes and once for a tricycle in the front yard. I cried when I read your story. Thank you for standing firm, for reminding us that we are not without influence." I read that message 3 times, and for the first time in weeks, I turned on the radio, settled back with my coffee, and allowed the quietude to be filled with something more agreeable. Not static, not directives. Merely the sound of power returning, not only to my home, but to those around me. I anticipated her eventual appearance. Claire Holbrook was not the type to remain in hiding for long, especially when control was eluding her meticulously manicured grasp. However, I did not expect her to storm across my property before 8 in the morning, still clad in a crisply pressed blouse, her heels clicking against the gravel as if she were marching into a courtroom rather than a stranger's driveway. "Mr. Reynolds," she commanded, her voice already heightened with panic, "you cannot do this." I did not respond immediately. I was kneeling, tightening the bolts on a recently installed line support bracket near the back gate. Scout stirred from his position by the porch, but remained still. He understood the distinction between genuine peril and hollow pronouncements. Claire moved closer. "You are deliberately disrupting power to over 200 homes. This is civil sabotage. I am contacting the mayor." I rose slowly, wiped my hands with a rag and met her gaze. Her face was flushed, more from exasperation than the heat. She was perspiring, her blouse clinging to her collarbone. Not an opportune morning for her central air conditioning to be non-functional. "I issued the maintenance notice last week," I stated calmly. "You received it, as did your legal representative. I have the read receipts." "You are not a public utility," she retorted sharply. "No, I am," I conceded. "A private infrastructure owner maintaining private equipment connected to an active distribution grid under an antiquated municipal contract, which, I might remind you, your HOA never bothered to read." "I do not care about contracts," she spat. "I care about the fact that my air conditioning unit is defunct. My security system is offline, and I am hosting a dinner party this evening with the Chamber of Commerce." I raised my eyebrows. That last detail revealed more than she intended. "Perhaps you should reschedule your party," I suggested. "Maintenance will continue through the weekend. The system should be fully restored by Monday morning." "You do not have the authority to decide," she shouted, stepping nearer. "You cannot dictate when we do or do not have power. That constitutes an abuse of authority." I could not help but chuckle. "You mean like cutting off someone's electricity without any legal basis, or trespassing to abscond with a generator, or levying fines for paint colors you personally dislike?" Her lips tightened into a thin, pale line. I walked past her toward the house, wiping grease from my hands. "We are concluded here," I said over my shoulder. "I will sue you," she yelled. "You have no comprehension of whom you are dealing with." I paused at the porch steps, turning slightly. "You still do not comprehend whom you are dealing with, Claire." And I truly meant it. Later that afternoon, I received an email from an attorney named Gregory Felsman. He introduced himself as representing Claire Holbrook in a potential civil action concerning power infrastructure impropriety. The tone was presumptuous, laden with threats, a classic display of boilerplate bravado. I responded with a 3-line email. "Mr. Felsman, please refer to the enclosed documents. Recorded substation deed, certified utility maintenance agreement, HOA boards signed acknowledgement of the same, dated 2 years ago. Additionally, I've copied the State Energy Oversight Committee and local press on this correspondence for complete transparency. Regards, Tom Reynolds, Willow Creek Systems, LLC." I did not anticipate a reply, and indeed none came. However, by evening, the phone began to ring again, not from Claire, but from neighbors. One gentleman from Birch Lane called to mention that his son's medical device had backup power, but he appreciated the advance notification and hoped the system would be stable by Monday. Another expressed gratitude for my finally confronting the despots in their red blazers. A third offered to bring me a 6-pack. By the following morning, someone had affixed a handwritten note to my fence. It read, "Power to the people, and thanks to the man who literally delivered it." Scout barked when he discovered it. I read it twice, then tucked it into my back pocket. Meanwhile, Claire had entered full damage control mode. She posted a frantic video on the neighborhood's private Facebook group, standing in her kitchen, illuminated solely by daylight. "This is illegal," she declared, the camera shaking in her hand. "This man has seized control of our grid. He's not a utility provider. He's a rogue engineer exploiting obscure legal loopholes to exact retribution upon your families. She proceeded to accuse me of weaponizing the substation, of being mentally unstable, and my favorite accusation, of orchestrating a conspiracy with city officials to undermine HOA governance. The comments quickly shifted. One woman replied, "You mean the same individual who restored our fire hydrants when the city ignored us for 2 years?" Another commented, "Claire, you cut off his power first. Why is it sabotage when he acts legally?" And one man simply wrote, "Perhaps it is time for a new HOA president." I did not comment. It was unnecessary. However, that afternoon, I printed the entire post, highlighted Claire's most outlandish accusations, and added it to my folder labeled Contingency Defamation. I had no intention of filing anything at that moment, but I had witnessed enough contentious HOA disputes to recognize that preparation constituted half the battle. The power remained disconnected through Sunday evening. I conducted the maintenance checks, logged the equipment seals, and meticulously verified the grounding resistances. Everything was in order. The system would function reliably. And early Monday morning, as the sun crested the ridge, I engaged the final circuit breaker. Power flowed silently back into the neighborhood. Air conditioning units clicked on. Garage doors hummed open. Porch lights flickered against the fading dawn. And from across the street, Claire emerged, clad in her robe and slippers. She stood there, gazing at my house, anticipating something, perhaps a confrontation, perhaps an apology, but all she received was the quiet, undeniable hum of current coursing through the lines. I possessed the systems, I performed the maintenance, and I held an authority she had never truly grasped. I offered her a nod from my porch, a simple, silent acknowledgement, not of victory, but of established boundaries. She did not wave back, nor did she speak, and that for once was sufficient. It began with a knock at the gate just after 9 in the morning. A polite, measured knock, unlike those from irate neighbors or clipboard-wielding HOA enforcement officers. I stepped out of the workshop, dressed in my denim shirt and boots, a faint sheen of grease still visible on my hands, to find a woman in a tailored navy blazer standing just outside the fence, her press badge already dangling from a lanyard. "Mr. Reynolds?" she inquired with a smile that conveyed more curiosity than warmth. "Mallory Grant, Channel 6 News. We spoke briefly last week." I nodded. "You brought a camera crew." She gestured behind her, where 2 men were unloading equipment from a white van bearing the insignia "Channel 6 Investigates" along its side. "Just 1 camera today, but we've received dozens of emails from viewers asking us to follow up on your story. It appears you've initiated something significant." I opened the gate and ushered them in. Mallory moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to bureaucratic stonewalling. Yet here, she encountered something entirely different, an individual with nothing to conceal. We commenced with a simple walkthrough. I escorted her to the substation, pointing out the reinforced fencing, the new signage, and the inspection logs, laminated and zip-tied to the interior panels. Her cameraman captured wide shots of the equipment, zoomed in on the voltage tags, and executed a slow pan across the private property placard bolted to the fence. "I must admit," Mallory remarked when we initially received the tip, "we assumed it was merely another HOA dispute. But this is something else entirely." I handed her a folder containing all the certified documents obtained from the clerk's office. Ownership deeds, maintenance agreements, and utility maps illustrating the grid's path through Creekwood Estates. She leafed through them, her eyes widening. "You genuinely own the essential infrastructure for their entire power supply." "For 3 years now," I stated. "I simply hadn't needed to remind anyone until they severed mine." We sat on the tailgate of my truck once more, just as we had previously. The camera rolled as she posed questions, genuine inquiries, focusing not solely on my personal involvement, but on the broader implications. "What happens," she asked, "when private citizens realize they can resist overreaching HOA policies, when they discover they have legal grounds to contest them?" "They begin asking the pertinent questions," I replied, such as, who truly holds authority and who is merely posturing as if they do? "Do you believe that's what the HOA here was doing?" "I believe they were quite comfortable in their unchecked power and were unprepared for someone to impose checks upon it. She nodded thoughtfully. And what about your neighbors? Have the community members supported you throughout this ordeal? I hesitated, then produced a bundle of printed messages I'd received. Emails, handwritten notes, and even a few Facebook comments I'd screenshotted before their deletion. Most of them, yes, I said, particularly after the power went out. Scout, who had been resting beneath the oak tree, emitted a low bark as another vehicle pulled to the curb. I managed to turn around precisely when Claire emerged, adorned in full makeup and a crimson blazer buttoned snugly across her torso. She was flanked by Martin and an unfamiliar man, their demeanor suggesting a desperate attempt to appear unfazed by adversity. Claire's gaze locked onto the approaching news crew, and she visibly tensed. Mallory rose, murmuring, "Looks like the Homeowners Association has arrived." I stepped aside, offering a quiet reply. "Let them speak." Claire approached with decisive clicks of her heels, each movement calculated. "Excuse me," she addressed Mallory, brushing past me. "I wish to issue a formal statement on behalf of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association." Mallory responded with a polite smile. "We're currently filming. Please proceed." Claire inhaled deeply. The HOA acknowledges a degree of confusion concerning the ownership of the substation infrastructure that services our community. We deeply regret any misunderstandings that may have transpired and are actively engaged in efforts to ensure greater clarity moving forward. Mallory inquired, her tone still sharp. "Is that an apology?" Claire paused. "It is a statement of cooperation." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "And what of the reported disconnection of power to Mr. Reynolds' residence and the photographic evidence of HOA personnel removing his generator?" Claire's voice tightened as she replied, "That matter is currently undergoing internal review. We are unable to comment on ongoing investigations." "Whose investigation?" I inquired, folding my arms. Claire offered no response. Martin cleared his throat. Mallory turned to me. "Mr. Reynolds, would you care to comment?" I met the camera's lens directly, my gaze steady. All I ever sought was respect for the established laws and the property boundaries, both in legal terms and in principle. I have diligently maintained this infrastructure for 3 years without seeking recognition. I have ensured this neighborhood remained operational during power outages and severe heat waves, all without charge. However, the moment I questioned a directive, they attempted to sever my connection. I took a deliberate breath. They perceived power as a tool for enforcement, but true strength lies in understanding righteousness and upholding it even when they endeavor to extinguish the light. Mallory gave the cameraman a subtle signal. "Cut!" Claire pivoted sharply and marched back to her vehicle without another word. Martin lingered, his eyes fixed on mine, a shift from frustration to something akin to respect, perhaps even apprehension. The third man, silent throughout, offered a slight nod before following suit. As the news team began to pack up, Mallory drew me aside. "We'll broadcast this segment tomorrow evening. I believe it will resonate far beyond mere ratings. Such narratives deserve to be shared." "I wasn't acting for the story," I stated. She smiled. "That's precisely why it will be effective." After they departed, I returned to the porch. The sun descended behind the ridge, bathing the yard in a golden hue. Scout rested beside me, his head nestled against my boot. For the first time in weeks, the pervasive sense of impending misfortune had vanished, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had been revealed. No matter how vociferously the HOA protested, their voices could no longer drown out that reality. A state inspector arrived on a Wednesday morning, precisely as communicated in his email. Alan Beckett, a no-nonsense individual in his late 50s, arrived with a clipboard, a reflective vest, and an unyielding demeanor. I had collaborated with Alan years prior during a severe winter grid failure in Bozeman. He was the go-to expert when city technicians couldn't assign blame for power disruptions. Known for his precision, thoroughness, and notable aversion to political maneuvering, he was ideal for this assignment. He parked his unmarked state vehicle, stepped out, adjusted his hard hat, and surveyed the substation perimeter. Spotting me by the gate, he grunted, "Reynolds." I smirked. "Beckett, still keeping this old relic running?" He responded with a rare smile. "Relics are still cleaner than half the entries in your report files." He then clicked his pen and commenced his work. For the subsequent 4 hours, we meticulously examined every aspect of the substation: voltage regulation, circuit routing, maintenance records, and grounding resistance. He conducted a full thermal scan of the transformers and even removed panel covers to inspect for corrosion or unauthorized rewiring. His commentary was minimal, consisting of terse notes in a blocky script and occasional grunts of approval or mild disapproval. It was typical Beckett. Approximately an hour into the inspection, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up and parked near the HOA clubhouse. Claire Holbrook emerged, impeccably dressed as always, with Martin following, a folder tucked under his arm. They positioned themselves at the property line, observing us from a distance that avoided direct interference, yet remained close enough to assert their presence. Beckett remained unfazed, not even glancing in their direction. Eventually, Claire called out, "Excuse me, Mr. Beckett. I would like to speak with you once you are finished." Without looking up, he replied, "Submit a formal request through the office like everyone else." I suppressed a smile and resumed pointing out the labeled feeds. By noon, our inspection was nearing completion when Alan finally peered over his glasses at me. "You stated they disconnected your residential line themselves?" he inquired. "Without authorization?" "I have video evidence," I confirmed. "It's time-stamped." He gave a brief nod. "And you claim they entered your property to remove a generator?" "Cut the cords and took it right off the concrete pad," I confirmed. "Where is it now?" I produced my phone and showed him a video clip provided by a neighbor depicting Martin dragging the generator into the clubhouse garage under the cover of night. The HOA hadn't even attempted to conceal their actions. Beckett emitted a low whistle. "Idiots!" He finally turned, acknowledging Claire and Martin across the street. With the composed authority of a judge entering a sentencing, he approached them, clipboard in hand. "You are claiming oversight authority here," he stated plainly. Claire offered a tight smile. "I am the HOA president and this—" Beckett interrupted. "I have reviewed the documentation. You possess no jurisdiction over that substation. You have no legal standing to enforce utility actions on private infrastructure, and should you even contemplate touching another line on this property, I will personally ensure your entire board is investigated for criminal trespass and utility tampering under State Statute 11.6.3. Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire's expression was one of utter shock. Beckett continued, flipping through his clipboard. "Your association has been found to be rerouting power feeds around residential plots without the requisite permits, bearing non-rated cables without insulation, and tapping unauthorized security systems onto grid relays designated solely for essential services." Claire blinked. I don't know anything about that." "It is irrelevant," Beckett stated. "Your name is on the filings. Ignorance does not absolve you of liability." She paled considerably. Martin appeared as though he might be ill. Beckett stepped back, already making notes. "I will have a report on your desk within 1 week, Mr. Reynolds," he called back to me. "The state will require these violations to be rectified and your ownership structure reinforced." "Copy that," I replied. Claire took a step forward. "This is clearly a misunderstanding." Alan raised a hand. "I have been in this field for 32 years, madam. I do not misunderstand wiring codes." With that, he returned to his vehicle, deposited the clipboard on the passenger seat, and drove away. A prolonged silence ensued. Claire turned to me, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. "You orchestrated this." "No," I countered, arms crossed. "You orchestrated this yourselves. I merely opened the curtains." She offered no further words, simply turned and walked back to the SUV. Martin followed, his shoulders slumped. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the hills. Scout lay beside me, his head resting on his paws, his tail giving a gentle twitch in his sleep. My inbox was once again inundated with emails. Residents were forwarding copies of the preliminary inspection report that had begun circulating, along with photographs of the inspector conversing with HOA members. Someone had even posted a meme in the neighborhood forum, superimposing Claire's face onto a fuse box with the caption, "Do not touch." It was a peculiar mixture of justice and amusement, but the most impactful message came from a teenager I barely knew who lived on the corner lot. He wrote, "Hey, Mr. Reynolds, I don't know much about politics or anything, but my parents said you stood up to people who have been bullies for years. They said no one has ever done that before. Just wanted to say thanks." That message resonated deeply, reminding me that this wasn't merely about fines, lines, or bylaws. It was about demonstrating to people that they possessed the right to assert their boundaries and declare, "This ends here." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the chirping of crickets and the soft hum of restored electricity flowing through the lines, and a realization dawned. For the first time in a considerable period, I felt more than just a man defending his property. I felt a connection to something larger, something more promising, something powered by truth. 3 days after the inspection report became public, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope, devoid of any HOA watermark, hand-delivered to every residence in the neighborhood. The handwriting on the exterior was stiff and awkward, as though penned by a trembling hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a printed statement, single-spaced, without letterhead, but featuring a bold heading, "Effective immediately, resignation of HOA President Claire Holbrook." The note contained minimal information, certainly not the apology many had anticipated. It consisted of 2 brief paragraphs of legalistic phrasing and blame shifting, citing health concerns, unforeseen burdens, and a lack of community support amidst misinformation. Yet everyone understood its true meaning: a white flag. I learned of it from a neighbor before I even received my copy. Janice, a retired schoolteacher from further up the street, jogged enthusiastically to my porch, waving her letter as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "She's out!" she exclaimed, breathless and beaming. "Claire's finally gone." I smiled, not with gloating, but from the sheer weight of how long this neighborhood had awaited this moment. Within hours, the HOA group chat erupted like a festive display. Reactions, emojis, and expressions of relief flooded in. A few attempted to defend her, suggesting she had done her best or had been misled, but the majority were simply overjoyed by her departure. Then came the truly unexpected announcement: an emergency notice calling for a special election to form a new HOA board. Apparently, Martin had also resigned quietly and without ceremony, having been directly implicated in the inspector's report for unauthorized rewiring and misappropriation of security system wiring. 5 seats were vacant, and nominations were open to any homeowner in good standing. For the first time since my arrival, a genuine sense of neighborliness began to emerge in conversations. My doorbell rang repeatedly throughout the afternoon. Individuals I'd barely interacted with were imploring me to run for a position. "Tom, we need someone who understands the infrastructure. You've shown you'll stand up for us. My husband says if you don't run, we're doomed." While humbled by these appeals, I declined each one. "I'm not interested in the politics," I stated. "I merely wanted to ensure the light stayed on." Nevertheless, I pledged to attend the election meeting, and that seemed to suffice. That evening, I took Scout for a walk along the Eastern Trail, where the power lines curved along the ridge like gentle brushstrokes. The substation emitted a soft hum in the distance, the setting sun casting a golden halo behind it. I recalled the initial day the lines went silent, how they had unhesitatingly cut off power to my house. I remembered sitting in the darkness questioning my sanity for challenging an entire board. And now, that board no longer existed. They hadn't merely lost, they had been exposed. The state report was unequivocal, laying out every violation in stark detail: unauthorized utility tampering, infringement of homeowner privacy rights, misuse of HOA funds for unapproved surveillance infrastructure, trespassing, and unlawful disconnection of essential services. The findings were forwarded to the city attorney, and through informal channels, I heard that Claire had already retained legal counsel. She had not been seen in the neighborhood since Alan Beckett's decisive intervention, and no one expressed any regret over her absence. The following week, the HOA election meeting convened, the room packed to capacity. More attendees were present than anyone could recall in years. Folding chairs were brought in from storage. Someone contributed cookies. People were smiling again, genuine smiles, not the strained, polite ones we had grown accustomed to faking. A young father named Jared delivered a brief address, emphasizing his desire for transparency, fairness, and homeowner education. A nurse named Laya spoke about establishing a community gardening fund. Even Janice, the woman who had practically sprinted to my porch, nominated herself, promising to restore humanity to the board. When the voting commenced, the atmosphere was calm. There were no raised voices or dramatic displays, only ballots, pens, and neighbors. Upon the conclusion of the vote and the introduction of the new board, someone requested a moment of final acknowledgement. All eyes turned towards me. I stood at the back, arms crossed, not expecting any recognition. While I sought no spotlight, it was bestowed upon me nonetheless. Janice stepped forward and declared, "Before we conclude tonight, I simply wish to express our gratitude to Mr. Tom Reynolds. You did not merely restore power, you restored trust." The room erupted in applause, with some individuals rising to their feet. I offered a single nod in acknowledgement. Afterward, as people dispersed, many stopped to shake my hand. A few offered quiet words of thanks, their eyes conveying a weariness born of years of being bullied into silence, of paying fees and fines out of a perceived lack of choice. Now they understood they had options. That night, Scout and I sat on the porch, the radio playing softly and the windows open to the gentle breeze. Lights twinkled across the neighborhood, a silent chorus of restored autonomy, lawn lights, porch lamps, garage motion sensors. I no longer felt the need to lead. My purpose had been fulfilled. I hadn't won an election, but I had achieved something more significant. A neighborhood liberated from the fear of its own leadership and the profound understanding that sometimes the most potent action is simply to stand your ground and refuse to be disconnected. Spring gracefully transitioned into early summer, bringing with it a rarity for this neighborhood: peace. Not the strained artificial quiet born from residents' attempts to placate the board, but a softer, more genuine tranquility. Laughter returned to the driveways. Porch swings creaked under the murmur of evening conversations. Sidewalk chalk reappeared in front of homes that had previously feared citations for unsightly markings. Throughout it all, the power remained consistent. Not solely electrical power, but the power of being heard, of knowing that a definitive line had been drawn and it was meant to be respected. I largely kept to myself, as was my nature. However, the isolation I once felt on this property, the burden of being surrounded by rules I'd never agreed to, had dissipated. Now when I walked Scout past the rows of houses, people waved. They stopped to engage in conversation. One young boy even rode up beside me on his bicycle, inquiring if I was the gentleman who had battled the HOA with wires. I chuckled and replied that I had utilized paperwork. He looked momentarily perplexed. "But didn't you own, like, the whole electricity place?" I nodded. "Still do." His eyes widened, as if I had confessed to owning a spaceship. That weekend I received a hand-delivered envelope, not from the HOA but from the new board president Laya, the nurse who had campaigned on promises of transparency and community healing. Inside was a formal agreement, drafted in conjunction with the city and reviewed by the State Energy Oversight Committee. It officially recognized Willow Creek Systems LLC as the private grid provider for Creekwood Estates, outlining maintenance protocols, emergency access rights, and most crucially, strict boundaries that no future board could breach without full consent and public disclosure. It was a beautifully crafted document, clear, professional, and binding. Laya had included a handwritten note. "Mr. Reynolds, thank you for protecting us even before we realized we needed protection. This agreement not only clarifies ownership but respects it. On behalf of a neighborhood, learning how to be better. Thank you, Laya." I signed the document the following morning and dispatched a copy to City Hall. That afternoon, I affixed a small plaque to the substation gate. It wasn't official or mandatory, merely a reminder, maintained with integrity for a community that chose truth over power. In the subsequent days, another shift occurred. Homeowners who had once felt powerless began to voice their opinions, not with anger, but with a clear sense of purpose. At the next community meeting, one resident proposed implementing rotational terms for HOA board positions, ensuring no single individual could wield unchecked authority for an extended period. Another suggested a community potluck in lieu of another newsletter filled with fines. Both motions were unanimously approved by the board, and for the first time since moving here, I no longer dreaded checking my mailbox. I had been prepared to relocate after that night, sitting in the dark, my generator gone, my lines severed. I had seriously considered packing up and moving to a more remote location, far from the reach of any governing board. But now I walked my property line with a profound sense of pride, not because I had emerged victorious from a conflict, but because I had safeguarded something truly valuable. One morning, I found Martin standing at the end of my driveway. He was dressed casually in jeans and a faded t-shirt, his hands in his pockets, devoid of his usual smug expression. I stepped outside. He nodded. "Heard you signed the agreement." "I did." "Good," he said quietly. "It's good." He paused, then added, "I wasn't aware of the line issues, the rewiring. Claire handled that part." "I believe you," I replied. "But you signed the orders." He nodded again, shame evident in his posture. "I should have paid more attention." "That's how it always begins," I responded. "One meeting, one rule, one unchecked action." "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed him. He didn't seek absolution or friendship. He simply turned and walked away. And in that moment, it felt right. Not everything required fixing. Some things simply needed acknowledgement. Weeks turned into months. The power flowed consistently. No more threats, no more clandestine meetings. This resilient, unassuming neighborhood on the fringe of a forgotten grid began to feel like something it had never been before. A place I was genuinely proud to call home. One evening, as Scout chased fireflies across the yard, I sat in my rocking chair and watched the lights flicker on across the neighborhood, slowly, softly, and predictably. Not a single house remained dark. Not a single complaint was filed. Only a quiet resilience humming through the lines. I thought of Martha, my late wife, and how she would have adored this view. She always maintained that true strength wasn't derived from force, but from clarity, from standing firm even when the world attempted to overwhelm you. And she had been right. I hadn't triumphed because I possessed power. I had won because I refused to allow it to be stolen, not my electricity, not my dignity, not my right to live free from apprehension. So, when people inquire now about what transpired, how I confronted an HOA and emerged unscathed, I offer the truth. They severed my power, so I provided them with a reminder of its true origin.